There's laws that relate to like internet fraud, which obviously didn't exist 50 years ago because there was no internet, but it's basically the same thing. Fraud was illegal 50 years ago, okay? So it's a different kind of fraud, it's internet fraud, but it's fairly easy to extend the basic premise of the few laws that you want over the ones you have. How do you achieve this? Well, first of all, through constitutional limitations, which is what our founding fathers tried to do, and succeeded for like 100 years. The first 100 years of this country, we actually had limited government, and then the limits started to fall apart. So I suspect what we would need is a renewed commitment and possibly some new limitations on what government can do. You want government limited to the very, very specific functions and keep it away from everything else. I think what's his name's freedom amendments, Mark Levin's, would not be such a bad place to start. I also think that things like government trying to persuade us to do things should be unconstitutional. I think it's absurd for a free people to vote to tax themselves, to have the government convince themselves to do something. That we should eat less salt, that we should spend more time with our kids. Okay, I'm going to be taxed, so the government can put commercials on television to try to get. I thought we were supposed to be running the government. Right? The government puts commercials on telling you to do stuff. Okay, things like that should have been unconstitutional from the beginning. I suspect would be had the founding fathers ever suspected that anything as crazy as that would ever happen. I also think, and I think this would be a huge step forward, that we ought to have no laws at all without a supermajority in both legislatures. I think if you said that for a federal law, you could do the same thing on the state level, that you have to get 2/3 of both houses of Congress to make any laws at all. I think that would be a very simple and very valuable improvement, because you would lose all of this stuff that barely gets squeaked by with bribing and cajoling and arm twisting and everything else. Obamacare has never been popular. It's never been in the majority. There's not been 1 minute from the point it was proposed till today that the majority of Americans have been in favor of Obamacare, and yet it got passed. Because you bribe and cajole the legislatures and they twist arms and get the majority together. If you required 2/3 from both houses, you'd get rid of most of this nonsense. And moreover, you would keep the few laws that you actually want to have. Laws against homicide would have no trouble at all getting 2/3. So that also would be, I think, a huge step in the right direction. Couple historical examples, if I may. At the end of World War I, we insisted that Germany had to become a democracy. That this Kaiser thing had to go, and they had to become a good democracy. What did it take? 12 years before the democracy came up with Adolf Hitler, whose rule would have been impossible without democracy. It's impossible to see a Hitler coming to power without democratic institutions to corrupt. It's worth noting, and we'll run into these in a few more historical examples, that a lot of people who are not even in favor of democracy take advantage of democracy to achieve what it is they want to get. And Hitler is clearly an early example of that. And there's many more. Does anyone remember a country called Rhodesia?
Named after Cecil Rhodes.
It was named after Cecil Rhodes, that is correct. It was in the 1970s the wealthiest, most prosperous nation in the entire continent of Africa. It had the best economy in Africa, best health care. According to Time magazine in 1976, they had the most powerful army, man per man. For the size of their army, they had the most effective army in the entire world. They had a life expectancy of 65, which was about what the life expectancy was in the United States at the time. They had a Rhodesian dollar that was worth double what the American dollar was worth. Their dollar was worth $2 American. And there was one little problem with Rhodesia, and that is that it was governed on what was essentially a racist regime. Rhodesia had 6 million black people and 300,000 white people. And the white people had all the political power, and the black people didn't have political power at all, not really. Now, it's a little bit more complicated. There were some blacks who could vote. There were seats reserved in the Rhodesian parliament specifically for blacks. To say that blacks were completely shut of everything was not true, but clearly the 300,000 were calling the shots, and the 6 million were not. And there was tremendous international pressure brought to bear on this little country of Rhodesia. They were boycotted by virtually everybody, and the pressure was that they had to become a democracy. They had to develop a system of one man, one vote. That was the slogan at the time. It was one man, one vote. And it's interesting because there were plenty of countries back then when nobody got to vote. And that didn't seem to bother people so much. The UN wasn't bothered by the countries where nobody could vote, but they were bothered by the country where the white minority could vote and the black majority couldn't. I remember having this argument about South Africa with a colleague of mine in college who thought there was nothing worse in the world than having a racial discrepancy on who could vote and who couldn't vote. And I never understood why that was worse than when nobody could vote at all. But I digress. And so they brought the political pressure to bear, and then eventually the white minority governments succumbed, and we ended up with black majority rule. And the first president they elected was a man named Robert Mugabe, who's still there. This was in 1979. He's still the president, and they changed the name of the country to Zimbabwe. It was Rhodesia, that became Zimbabwe, and he's still there. By an example, by the way, of people who take advantage of democracy, who don't actually believe in democracy. He's cheated in every election, since then. He's in his 90s. He's still in power. Do you know what a Zimbabwe dollar is worth? It was worth $2 back in the 70s. Okay, when they stopped printing them last year. When they stopped printing them, it was, I believe, 5 quintillion to 1. $1 US would get you 5 quintillion. You know what quintillion is? It's like million, billion, trillion, quadrillion, quintillion. Okay, that's how much power, much buying power the Zimbabwe dollar lost.
I think the printing press in Germany just simply refused to print them anymore.
Yeah, at a certain point, it just doesn't even matter to print them anymore. You know what the life expectancy is today in Zimbabwe? 37. It was 65 in the 1970s. It's down to 37. It is the rape capital of the world. More rapes per capita than any other place on earth. It is the murder capital of the world. More murders than any other country on the entire earth. It is, in fact, a hellhole. And I want to be very clear here. The whites have all fled. There's virtually the 300,000, there weren't very whites to begin with. They're virtually all gone. Okay? What we're looking at is we're not talking about white people. We're talking about the fact that blacks were way, way, way better off in the 1970s under a regime where they couldn't vote than they are today with the vote. What destroyed Rhodesia is very clearly democracy. The question is, the Western press is like talking about issues like this. The question is, what do we learn from this point? And what we learn, obviously there's different ways of interpreting it. You could have a racist interpretation, and you could say, well, black people just can't run the country. Thomas Sowell, who talks about this a lot, says that in the first half of the 20th century, discrepancies between blacks and whites were all presented as being caused by race. That was, for the first half of the 20th century, that was the answer. Okay? Some races are just better than other races. either Hillary or the soccer team.
Yeah, it's soccer. It's just soccer.
The soccer team. Yeah.
Goal.
The first half of the 20th century,
I'm fine.
some races were just better than other races, and the black people were at the bottom and the whites were at the top. If we were going to do this today, you'd probably have to put the Orientals on top because they tend to outtest whites and everything. And it was all like, you know, stratified like this. And then in the second half of the 20th century, the answer became racism. That racism was the cause of everything. And so if the discrepancy between white, it's all caused by the legacy of racism, and that's the explanation. And Sowell rejects both of these and says that it's probably based on cultural issues. That there's cultural behaviors that leads to certain results. And I suspect he's much closer to the likely truth than either of the two earlier theories are. We see this in things that, for example, in the United States, black children who are adopted by white families have almost no statistical significance in school performance than the white children do. Whereas there's a huge difference between black children in the main and white children in their performance. Now, when we apply this to Rhodesia, it seems to me the answer is very straightforward, and that is that the white people who ran Rhodesia believed in capitalism.